Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. So today we're going to be taking a look at a pretty intense book. It's called The Next Civil War Dispatch by Stephen Marche. And you hear all this stuff in the news about political violence and climate change and the economy kind of teetering on the edge.
Right.
And Marche is saying that all of that stuff is actually putting America on the path to, another civil war.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about this book is that Marche doesn't just sort of lay out the facts and figures.
Yeah.
He actually weaves in these fictional stories, these little vignettes.
Oh, interesting.
That really bring the potential consequences of these threats to life.
Okay, so give me an example. What kind of fictional scenario does he paint?
Well, one of the things he talks about is how even something as small as a train delay.
A train delay?
Yeah, a train delay could have changed the course of the first Civil War.
Wow.
And it makes you think, what seemingly minor event today, could be the spark that ignites a much larger conflict.
Right. That's a really unsettling thought.
I mean,
it makes you wonder, what are those pressure points? What are those seemingly insignificant things that could actually, snowball into something much bigger?
And to illustrate that, he has this one scenario that he paints where there's a standoff between the U.S. military and these anti-government forces.
Yeah.
And it's all triggered by this, local sheriff who just refuses to follow federal law.
Oh, wow. So the military actually fighting against U.S. citizens.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty heavy stuff. We're not talking about a protest or a riot. This is full-blown armed conflict.
Armed conflict. And, it brings up the question of, can the U.S. military actually win a war against its own citizens?
That's a question I never thought I'd have to ask. Speaking of these anti-government forces, I think you mentioned earlier that he talks specifically about the hard right.
He does.
And how they're preparing for this kind of conflict.
Yeah, he really highlights the growth of this anti-government sentiment, especially among these hard right groups.
And what are these groups like? I mean, are we talking about a monolithic entity, or is it more...
diverse than that.
Quite diverse.
Yeah.
They range from your sort of small government conservatives to white supremacists and conspiracy theorists.
So it's a real mix of ideologies and motivations.
It is. But what unites them is this deep distrust of the federal government. And, in some cases, a belief that violence is actually necessary to achieve their political goals.
So these aren't just people, complaining online or, griping at the dinner table. They're actually taking steps to prepare for a potential armed conflict.
Exactly.
What does that even look like?
Well, he points to things like training camps.
Yeah.
Stockpiling weapons and even attempts to infiltrate law enforcement agencies.
Yeah.
Pretty scary stuff. And, he argues that the hard right is actually a significant source of domestic terrorism in the U.S.
Wow. So the potential for violence is very real.
Oh, absolutely. And then you add on top of all of that, the internet and social media. It's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Yeah, it's like everyone's just in their own echo chamber, shouting past each other.
Nobody's listening.
Nobody's listening. And, he talks about this concept of information pollution.
Information pollution.
Yeah, it's not just about spreading lies. It's about creating these echo chambers where people only hear what confirms their existing biases, no matter how extreme.
Right. And everybody's just retreating further and further into these.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. He uses the character of the sheriff that we talked about before as a way to show how these online platforms can actually radicalize individuals and turn them into figureheads for these violent movements.
Okay, so we've got this political polarization. You've got armed groups. We've got online radicalization. It's like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, where does this leave everyday people?
Right.
How are people supposed to navigate this increasingly divided landscape?
It's tough. And Marche actually touches on this. He talks about the statistic about Thanksgiving dinners.
Thanksgiving dinners.
Yeah. Families with opposing political views are having significantly shorter meals together.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's like a little microcosm of the bigger problem.
It is like these divisions are impacting our most personal relationships.
And it's not just politics, right?
Yeah.
Marche also ties this to bigger societal issues like climate change,
absolutely,
economic inequality.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
He sees these underlying issues as fuel for extremism.
Because when people feel like the system is rigged against them,
exactly,
that their basic needs aren't being met,
right,
then they become more susceptible to these radical ideologies.
They're looking for answers.
Right.
They're looking for someone to blame.
And speaking of climate change, one of the things that really stuck with me was his description of what could happen to New York City.
Yeah.
he talks about these cascading failures.
Right.
What does that even mean?
Well, think of it like a chain reaction.
Okay.
One event triggers another and then another, and it leads to this complete breakdown of these essential systems.
So it's not just about the immediate impact of, like, let's say, a hurricane.
No,
It's about
the ripple effects.
Right.
So New York City, for example, you could have a major hurricane, exacerbated by rising sea levels.
Okay.
And that could knock out power, cripple transportation, disrupt food supplies.
And then all of a sudden you have chaos.
Widespread chaos.
And potentially
social unrest.
Social unrest, exactly.
Wow. I mean, it makes you wonder if any city is truly prepared for that kind of scenario.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. And, on top of all of this, Marche brings up another really unsettling point. The potential for presidential assassination.
Right.
He actually highlights that the odds of a U.S. president being assassinated are surprisingly high.
1 in 11.
1 in 11.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. It is a scary thought. But he doesn't just throw out the statistic. He uses this fictional character of the assassin
Oh, interesting.
to explore the psychology behind political violence.
So he's trying to get into the mind of someone who might commit such an act.
And he breaks down the path to such an act into 3 stages.
Okay, what are those stages?
The first is exposure to the means and the opportunity.
Okay.
The second is a belief that violence is morally justified. And finally, there's this escalating pressure that kind of pushes someone over the edge.
So it's like this perfect storm of personal circumstances
Yeah.
and this toxic political climate.
Exactly. It's not always about some grand conspiracy. Sometimes it's about individual choices made in a moment of desperation or despair.
So we've got all these factors, pointing toward instability and potential violence. But, I mean, if Marche is right and the U.S. is really on this path toward another civil war, wouldn't the military be able to step in and restore order?
Right. We always think of the U.S. military as this, all-powerful force.
The most powerful fighting force in the world.
But that's where things get a little bit complicated.
Right.
Because Marche argues that the U.S. military, despite its might not actually be able to win a war against its own citizens.
Wait, what? How could they not win?
It's not really about firepower.
Right.
It's about the nature of the conflict itself. He dives into the complexities of counterinsurgency warfare and points out that even if the military defeats the enemy on the battlefield, they risk further alienating the population and deepening the very divisions they're trying to overcome.
So it's like a no-win situation.
In a way.
Yeah, they can win the battles, but lose the war.
Exactly. And he actually quotes this retired general who says that counterinsurgency is a militarily futile and stupid thing to engage in.
Wow.
Those are strong words.
Yeah.
But they're coming from someone with firsthand experience in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And it really highlights the fact that military solutions often fail to address the root causes of these internal conflicts.
Especially in a country as large and diverse as the United States.
Exactly.
So if the military isn't the answer, then what is? I mean, Marche does bring up this idea of secession.
He does.
As a potential solution.
Yeah.
It sounds pretty radical, though.
It is radical, but he presents it as this possible alternative to violence.
Yeah.
Imagine instead of this bloody civil war, you have regions with just irreconcilable differences choosing to peacefully separate.
It's basically like a messy divorce.
Kind of.
But on a national scale.
Exactly.
I mean, how would that even work?
Yeah. He acknowledges that there would be immense legal and logistical challenges.
Yeah.
Like how do you divide assets and resources? What about border security? And, how do you even get international recognition for these newly formed nations?
Yeah. And what about the cultural and social implications? I mean, would we see different parts of America, developing even more distinct identities, maybe even becoming more isolated from each other?
It's a good question.
It's hard
to one that's hard to answer definitively.
Yeah.
But he does point to some existing movements, like the Texas nationalist movement or the Collexit movement, as examples of how these secessionist sentiments are already taking root in certain parts of the country.
And it's not just fringe groups, right?
No, it's becoming...
He mentions that 25% of U.S. states have active secessionist movements.
That's a quarter of the country.
Yeah. That's a lot.
It's a significant number.
It really makes you wonder, what would a divided America look like in practice?
It's hard to fathom.
Yeah.
But he explores some possibilities. He points out that some potential breakaway states like Texas and California would actually be economic powerhouses on the world stage.
Because they have that.
They have the population, they have the resources. He even gives some numbers. Texas would have the 10th largest GDP globally, while California would rank 5th, surpassing even the UK.
Wow. That's mind-blowing.
It is.
I mean, it's hard to even wrap your head around that. But what about the rest of the country?
That's a big question mark.
Right.
The book doesn't offer any easy answers, but it does raise some crucial questions about resource distribution, border security, and how these new nations would interact, both with each other and with the rest of the world.
Okay, so we've talked about Civil War, secession, the collapse of democracy. It's all pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
I have to admit, it's all a bit overwhelming.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah. I mean, Does Marche offer any reason for hope?
He does, and it's important to highlight that, he's not saying that America is doomed. He believes that none of these crises are insurmountable if Americans choose to confront them with honesty, courage, and a willingness to compromise.
But he uses that analogy of the ship slowly taking on water.
Yeah.
What was it he said we need to do?
He says the key is not to pretend that the problem doesn't exist or to get caught up in infighting and blaming each other.
Right.
Instead, we need to work together to bail out the water and fix the leaks before it's too late.
So it's a call to action. It's a reminder that the future isn't predetermined.
Exactly.
It's something that we can shape if we act decisively and collectively.
We have agency.
So there's still a chance for America to pull through this.
There is.
But what would that look like? I mean, what specific steps does Marche recommend we take to kind of steer the ship in the right direction?
He doesn't necessarily lay out this step-by-step plan.
Okay.
But he does offer some guiding principles.
Okay, let's hear him.
First and foremost, he stresses the importance of confronting our problems head-on.
So no more denial.
No more denial.
No more kicking the can down the road.
Exactly. We have to acknowledge the depth of the challenge.
It's like going to the doctor. You can't get the right treatment if you don't admit that you're sick.
Exactly.
Right.
And once we acknowledge the problem, he urges us to recommit to these core democratic values. Things like civil discourse, respect for different viewpoints, and a genuine willingness to compromise.
Right. It's like we've forgotten how to disagree without being disagreeable.
Yeah, and it's essential for a healthy democracy.
And, Marche even suggests that we need to rethink our relationship with the Constitution. I mean, that sounds a bit radical, doesn't it?
He's not saying we should throw it out.
Right.
But he does challenge this idea that it's this sacred document that must be interpreted literally.
So less reverence.
He encourages us to see it as a living document, capable of adapting to the changing realities of our time.
So what kind of changes does he have in mind?
Well, he throws out some pretty big ideas.
Yeah.
Things like reforming the electoral system, addressing the issue of unequal representation in the Senate, and even rethinking the role of the federal government in a deeply divided society. These are complex issues with no easy answers. But he's urging us to at least start the conversation.
And let's not forget those underlying issues that he keeps coming back to: economic inequality and climate change.
Right.
He seems to see them as kind of interconnected.
Absolutely.
Right.
He actually calls climate change a threat multiplier.
A threat multiplier.
It's not just an environmental problem.
Right.
It's an economic problem, a social problem, a national security problem.
It affects everything.
It affects everything.
And he's saying that we need this fundamental shift in our values to address these challenges effectively.
We can't just keep doing what we've been doing.
So what does he mean by a shift in values? Can you give me an example?
Sure. He talks about moving away from the short-term thinking and individual gain and towards a more sustainable and equitable future.
So it's about recognizing that we're all in this together.
Yeah.
That our individual well-being is tied to the health of our communities and the planet as a whole.
Exactly. It's a more holistic view.
So it's like a national reset.
In a way, yeah.
A return to those core American ideals, but adapted for the 21st century.
It's a tall order.
It is.
But it sounds like Marche believes it's possible.
He does. And he ends the book on a note of cautious optimism.
Yeah, he reminds us that America has faced difficult times before.
Right.
That we've overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges.
Yeah, we have a history.
He doesn't shy away
from the dangers.
Yeah. But he also reminds us that we have the resilience and the ingenuity to navigate this really difficult period.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to get bogged down in all the negativity, but it's important to remember that we have agency. that we can shape our own future.
Exactly. And that brings us back to one of the book's most important messages. The future is not predetermined.
Right.
It's something we create through our choices and our actions, both big and small.
So this deep dive, it hasn't exactly been, a lighthearted stroll through the park.
It's heavy stuff.
But it's been incredibly thought-provoking.
It really makes you think.
And if you're looking to delve deeper into these issues and really grapple with those big questions about the future of America, I highly recommend checking out The Next Civil War Dispatch.
Absolutely.
It's not an easy read.
No, it's not.
But it's a necessary one.
It is.
It's a book that challenges us to think critically.
To confront uncomfortable truths.
And ultimately to take responsibility for the future that we're creating.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
And until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations going.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like saying, okay, we can send in the troops. We can crush this rebellion, but then what?
Right. What happens the day after the war ends?
Exactly. You've alienated huge chunks of the population. You've probably destroyed a lot of infrastructure, and, you haven't really addressed the underlying issues that led to the conflict in the first place.
So it's a very short-sighted solution.
It is, and it ignores the fact that, civil wars aren't like conventional wars. You're not fighting a foreign enemy. You're fighting your own people.
And that's where things get really messy.
It does, it becomes this whole quagmire of, trying to win hearts and minds and, rebuilding trust. And it's a really difficult situation.
Well, and I think that's why Marche brings up this idea of secession.
Right.
As a potential solution.
Yeah.
Because at least on the surface, it seems to offer a way out of this cycle of violence.
It does. Instead of having this bloody civil war, you have, regions with these really deep, irreconcilable differences just choosing to go their separate ways.
Yeah, so you're basically trading a hot war for a kind of cold peace.
In a sense.
I mean, but the question is, how would that even work in practice?
Yeah.
How do you untangle a country as complex and interconnected as the United States?
Right. It's a massive undertaking. And Marche, he goes into some of the logistical challenges, like how do you divide up assets and resources?
Right.
What about, border security?
And what about things like, Social Security and Medicare? I mean, these are federal programs that cover the entire country.
How do you disentangle all of that?
And then there's the question of international recognition. I mean, would these new nations be welcomed by the global community?
Yeah, and would they be able to, defend themselves?
Right. Would they have to build up their own military?
It's a lot to consider.
It is. And I think it raises these bigger questions about what it even means to be American.
Right.
If the country's fractured like that, what holds us together?
And what happens to our shared history?
Our shared culture.
Our shared values.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really profound question. And Marche doesn't pretend to have all the answers.
No, but he does offer some really interesting food for thought.
He does. And, one of the things that I found really striking was his discussion of the economic implications of secession. Because he points out that some of these potential breakaway states, like Texas and California, they would actually be economic powerhouses.
They would own, right?
They have the resources, the population.
He actually gives some numbers. He says that Texas would have the 10th largest GDP globally.
Wow.
While California would rank 5th.
Surpassing even the UK.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about.
It is.
But then it makes you wonder what happens to the rest of the country.
Exactly. Are they left behind?
Do they become kind of like this, forgotten middle?
Right. And how do they, adapt to this new reality?
So we've talked about civil war, we've talked about secession, and now we're talking about the potential for economic upheaval.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to admit, it's all starting to feel a bit apocalyptic.
It's a lot.
Does Marche offer any glimmer of hope?
He does. He does. And I think it's really important to emphasize that, he's not saying that America is doomed. He believes that none of these crises are insurmountable.
Okay.
But he also stresses that we can't just keep doing what we've been doing. We have to change course.
So what does that look like? What kind of changes does he think are necessary? Well, he talks about this idea of a fundamental shift in our values.
Values? Like what?
Like moving away from this, constant focus on short-term thinking and individual gain.
Right.
And instead, kind of embracing a more sustainable and equitable vision for the future.
So basically recognizing that we're all in this together.
Exactly. You know, our individual well-being is ultimately tied to the health of our communities and to the health of the planet as a whole.
So it's like a more holistic view?
Yeah, exactly.
A real, national reset.
Kind of, yeah.
A return to those, core American ideals, but, adapted for the 21st century.
Right.
It's a tall order.
And it is a tall order.
But it sounds like Marche, despite all the doom and gloom, he does believe it's possible.
He does. He ends the book on this note of cautious optimism. He reminds us that America has faced, difficult times before.
Right. We've overcome some pretty big
overcome them. Yeah. He doesn't shy away from the dangers that we're facing.
Of course.
But he also reminds us that, we have the resilience, the ingenuity to navigate this, this difficult period.
It's a good reminder. It's easy to get bogged down by all the, the negativity out there. But, ultimately, we do have agency.
We do.
We can shape our own future.
And that brings us back to, one of the book's most important messages, I think.
Which is?
The future isn't predetermined. It's something that we create through our choices.
Our actions.
Our actions, both big and small.
So this deep dive hasn't exactly been, a lighthearted stroll through the park.
No.
It's been pretty intense.
Heavy stuff.
But it's been incredibly thought-provoking.
It really makes you think.
And if you're looking to, really delve deeper into these issues.
Yeah.
And grapple with, some of these big questions about the future of America.
Absolutely.
I highly recommend checking out The Next Civil War Dispatch.
It's a must-read.
It's not an easy read.
No, it's not.
But I think it's a necessary one.
It is.
It's a book that really challenges us to, think critically.
To confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
And ultimately, to take responsibility for the future that we're creating.
Well said.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those minds curious and those conversations going.